In 1981, Steven Callahan was an experienced and seasoned sailor. With years of nautical experience under his belt, he had come to know the rhythm of the sea and the intricacies of life on the water. By this time, he had already completed several solo sailing expeditions, which had earned him a reputation as someone who could endure and thrive in the most demanding conditions. He wasn't just an adventurer, he was a meticulous planner. Every voyage he undertook was carefully mapped out, every detail accounted for. Steven was no stranger to the challenges the ocean could present, but nothing could have prepared him for the journey he was about to embark upon, one that would test his endurance, spirit, and survival skills like never before. The goal was clear: sail across the Atlantic Ocean from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean. It was a daunting task, but Steven believed in his preparation. He had the perfect boat for the job, a 21-foot sloop called the Napoleon Solo. The boat was compact but well-equipped for long-distance solo voyages. It had been designed to handle the unpredictable nature of the open ocean, built to withstand the strong currents and storms that could arise without warning. The first few days of the journey were filled with excitement. The weather was calm, and the sea appeared tranquil, with light winds that allowed Steven to set a steady course toward his destination. He had a sense of peace and excitement as he sailed further into the vast expanse of the ocean. The quietude of the water and the rhythmic motion of the boat under his feet were comforting, allowing Steven to slip into the familiar routine of a sailor on the open sea. Steven spent his days adjusting sails, navigating by the stars, and maintaining the boat. The work was physically demanding, but also deeply satisfying. The silence of the ocean seemed to amplify his thoughts, and he often reflected on his life, his love of sailing, and the deep connection he felt with the sea. To him, the ocean was both a challenge and a sanctuary. There was something peaceful in the isolation it offered, even as it held the potential for danger. But everything would change when the weather began to shift unexpectedly. Just 4 days into his voyage, Steven found himself in the path of a severe storm. It came out of nowhere, a sudden and powerful burst of wind and rain that appeared to emerge from the horizon like a beast, intent on devouring anything in its path. The storm clouds loomed ominously above, blotting out the sun as they swallowed up the clear sky. Steven knew that he had to prepare quickly. There would be no avoiding this one. His first instinct was to secure the boat and batten down the hatches, hoping that the Napoleon Solo could weather the storm. The winds picked up suddenly, howling through the rigging of the boat as the waves swelled around him. The sea seemed to come alive with fury, and Steven, determined to maintain control, fought to keep the boat steady. Despite his years of experience, he had never faced anything quite like this. The power of the ocean was far more immense than he could have ever imagined. The waves crashed relentlessly against the hull of his boat, and the winds screamed, snapping the sails like a whip. Steven could feel the boat being tossed and turned as though it were a toy in the hands of a child. He had no choice but to fight back. The storm was more than just an inconvenience. It was a violent, life-threatening force of nature. The boat groaned under the pressure, each wave threatening to capsize it. In those harrowing moments, Steven knew that he had to act quickly if he was going to survive. But no matter what he did, the storm's rage seemed relentless. The Napoleon Solo was designed for rough conditions, but even the best-built vessels could only withstand so much. The violent force of the waves and wind began to tear at the boat, and it was clear that the situation was deteriorating quickly. It wasn't long before Steven realized that the boat was taking on water. His worst fears were beginning to materialize. He had to make a choice: abandon the boat or try to salvage it. In a moment of clarity, he made the painful decision to abandon the Napoleon Solo. The storm was simply too much for the boat to handle, and continuing to fight it was only going to make things worse. With the storm's fury intensifying, Steven grabbed what he could: his survival kit, a few fishing supplies, and the small life raft that was his only chance of survival. He had little time to think. His focus was entirely on survival. He watched in disbelief as the boat he had worked so hard to prepare was ripped apart by the storm. It was as though the ocean itself had claimed the Napoleon Solo as its prize. As the boat sank beneath the waves, Steven found himself alone in the middle of the vast ocean. The storm raged on, but he no longer had any control. His only lifeline now was the small, inflatable raft that bobbed on the tumultuous sea. The harsh winds carried the remnants of the storm across the ocean, but Steven's mind was already racing with the brutal reality of his situation. He was alone, no land in sight, no one around for miles. The vastness of the ocean was both beautiful and terrifying. It stretched endlessly in every direction, a never-ending expanse of blue water with no sign of civilization or hope. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. Yet amid the silence that followed the storm, Steven's survival instincts kicked in. He knew he had to remain calm and think clearly if he was going to make it out alive. The life raft was small and not designed for long-term survival. It was built for emergencies, but Steven's situation was far from an emergency. It was a full-blown survival crisis. There was no safety net here. The raft was his only source of refuge, and he had to make it work. As the storm subsided and the winds calmed, Steven took stock of his situation. The raft was intact, though it had already been buffeted by the storm. He had a few basic supplies, a small fishing kit, a knife, some water containers, and emergency rations. But these supplies were limited, and the odds were not in his favor. The silence that followed the storm was deafening. Steven felt the weight of the situation press down on him. He had no way of knowing where he was, how far he had been blown off course, or even if anyone knew he was missing. His radio and communication equipment had been lost with the boat, and he was now entirely at the mercy of the sea. The days ahead would stretch on without mercy. With no land in sight, Steven knew that every decision he made would be critical to his survival. The ocean could be both cruel and unforgiving, but Steven had one thing in his favor: his indomitable will to survive. He had been in tough situations before, but nothing could have prepared him for this. Now, all he could do was fight against the elements, fight against hunger, and fight for the chance to see land again. As he settled into the raft and tried to orient himself, Steven made one solemn promise to himself: he would not give up. He had survived storms before. He had the knowledge, the skills, and most importantly, the determination to face whatever lay ahead. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was merely a new beginning. As the days passed, Steven Callahan began to understand the severity of his situation. The ocean around him seemed endless, a vast expanse of blue that stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction. There was no land in sight, and the only sounds were the gentle swaying of the raft against the water and the occasional squawk of seabirds overhead. The storm had passed, but it had left Steven with more than just the wreckage of his boat. It had left him with the overwhelming realization that he was now completely alone, stranded in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, with only his survival skills and limited resources to rely on. The first day after the storm was a blur. Steven was still processing the shock of losing his boat, his equipment, and any hope of communication with the outside world. As the raft bobbed on the waves, Steven began to take stock of his situation. He had no choice but to be pragmatic. The small, inflatable raft was not built for long-term survival. It was meant to be a temporary emergency shelter until rescue arrived. But there was no rescue on the horizon, and he could not afford to wait for one. The most immediate challenge was water. Without a fresh supply of drinking water, dehydration would become his biggest enemy. Steven had a small plastic container to collect rainwater, but he had no idea when the next storm would come, or how much water he could catch. For now, he had to ration the small amount of water he had left in his emergency supply. But even that supply was limited, and it wouldn't last long. Dehydration set in quickly. As the sun beat down on him, the heat was oppressive. Even in the relative shelter of the raft, Steven felt as though the sun was slowly draining him of his energy. He knew he had to act quickly, or he would succumb to the effects of dehydration. He began to use every trick he knew to conserve moisture. He stopped sweating as much by lying still during the hottest part of the day, minimizing his exposure to the scorching sun. But it wasn't enough. His mouth was dry, his throat scratchy, and his energy was rapidly waning. By the second day, Steven realized he needed to find a way to catch rainwater more effectively. He used a piece of plastic sheeting from his survival kit, rigging it to catch rainwater and funnel it into his container. He had to rely on the unpredictable nature of the weather. At times, the ocean would remain calm, and the sun would continue its relentless barrage. Other times, dark clouds would gather in the distance, offering a brief respite in the form of a rainstorm. The only food he had were the rations he had managed to grab before abandoning his boat: a few cans of tuna, some energy bars, and dried fruit. But the food was already running low. Every bite was a calculated decision, carefully rationed to stretch as long as possible. The harsh reality was that he could not afford to indulge in meals. His priority was survival, and food was secondary to hydration. The first few days of survival were consumed with basic needs: water, food, and protection from the elements. But as the days wore on, Steven began to realize that survival was about more than just meeting immediate needs. The mental strain of being stranded on the ocean was immense. The isolation was suffocating, and the silence of the sea was deafening. Every day seemed to blend into the next, each one indistinguishable from the last. The raft offered little comfort, and every shift in the weather made him feel more vulnerable. At night, the temperature dropped, and the cold was unbearable. The raft provided no shelter from the chill that set in after sunset, and Steven would often huddle in his small survival blanket, shivering against the cold. The ocean seemed to mock him with a its endless expanse. There were no sounds of civilization, no signs of life. It was just him and the vast, unyielding sea. Despite the grim circumstances, Steven refused to let despair take hold of him. He had been trained in survival tactics, and now was the time to put that knowledge to use. He had to stay sharp, stay focused, and find ways to maintain his hope. Every day was a test of his resolve, but every day was also an opportunity to survive, to fight back against the elements. One of the few things he could do to occupy his mind was fish. Steven had a small fishing kit that he had grabbed from his boat, and he knew he needed to find food to sustain him. At first, fishing seemed like an impossible task. The ocean was vast, and the fish seemed to be elusive. But Steven was determined. He fashioned makeshift fishing lines from bits of string, using his limited resources to improvise as best as he could. He would lower his lines into the water and wait, sometimes for hours, hoping for a bite. Eventually, the first fish came. It was small, but it was enough to satisfy his hunger for the moment. Catching that first fish brought a small glimmer of hope. It proved to Steven that survival was still possible. He wasn't completely helpless. He could still provide for himself, even if only in small ways. The fish provided not just sustenance, but a morale boost. Each catch, no matter how small, was a victory. It was a reminder that survival was possible, even in the most dire of circumstances. He would cook the fish over a small fire he managed to start on the raft, using the limited supplies he had. The warmth of the fish, the smell of it cooking, became a comforting ritual. It wasn't just about food, it was about maintaining his sense of normalcy in the face of overwhelming adversity. But fishing didn't solve all of his problems. His life raft was slowly deteriorating. The sun and salt water were taking a toll on the raft's fabric, and it began to lose air. Steven would have to patch it up as best as he could, using any available materials. The raft was his lifeline, and he couldn't afford to let it fail. Yet, as the days dragged on, the raft seemed to be slowly deflating, adding to his anxiety. As time went on, Steven found himself in a battle not just against the physical elements, but against his mind. Loneliness gnawed at him constantly. He had always been a solitary person, but this was different. This wasn't solitude, it was isolation. His mind began to play tricks on him. He would imagine seeing land on the horizon, or he would hear voices calling his name, only to find nothing when he looked. The line between reality and hallucination blurred, and he struggled to hold on to his sanity. But through it all, Steven held on to the most precious thing he had: hope. His days on the raft were not just about surviving. They were about enduring, pushing forward despite the overwhelming odds. Every sunrise brought with it a new chance, a new possibility. And every sunset reminded him that he had made it through another day. At the end of each day, Steven would reflect on his situation. His body was growing weaker, his supplies were dwindling, and his raft was becoming less reliable. Yet, in the depths of his struggle, he found the strength to carry on. The ocean was vast, and the challenges were great, but Steven Callahan was a survivor, The fight was far from over, and as the days stretched on, he held on to the one thing that kept him going, the belief that he could make it out alive. By now, Steven Callahan had been adrift on the Atlantic Ocean for more than 2 months. 75 days had passed, each one marked by a relentless struggle to stay alive. His body had grown thinner, his face was sunken and weathered, and the once bright spark in his eyes had dimmed with exhaustion. But despite the toll it had taken, Steven was not ready to give up. His survival instincts were sharp, and his will to live was stronger than ever. Each day had been an act of sheer determination. The pain from his dehydration and malnutrition was constant, gnawing at him from the inside. His raft had lost more air, and he had patched it as best as he could with the materials he had. The fishing lines he used had become worn, but he managed to continue catching small fish, providing a bit of nourishment when he could. And rainwater, though sporadic, continued to be his only source of hydration. The ocean, once a vast, beautiful expanse of possibility, now felt like a prison. The isolation was crushing, and the silence was deafening. It seemed as though the world had forgotten him. But Steven refused to let that silence define him. Every day, he clung to the belief that help was out there, that someone, somewhere, was looking for him. For the past few days, Steven had begun to notice something. A ship. At first, it seemed like a figment of his imagination, a mirage created by the desperation in his mind. But then, he saw it again. A dark shape in the distance, barely visible on the horizon. It was hard to tell if it was a ship or just a trick of the light. But Steven didn't let himself get discouraged. He waved his arms as best as he could, using a piece of cloth from his survival kit as a signal. The waves and wind threatened to sweep away his efforts, but he held on, hoping against hope that someone would see him. On the 76th day, just as the sun began to sink below the horizon, Steven saw it again. A ship. This time, it was closer, and it was unmistakable. A real ship, not a mirage. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Was this it? Was this his chance? He didn't hesitate. With the last ounce of strength he had, Steven waved the cloth in the air, shouting with all the energy he could muster. His throat was raw from days of dehydration, but he shouted anyway, hoping against hope that someone on that ship would see him. He had survived 75 days on the ocean, and now, in this final moment, he was going to give it everything he had. The ship's crew had spotted him. They lowered a boat and quickly made their way towards Steven's raft. As they approached, Steven could hardly believe it. He was too weak to even stand, but he managed to raise his hand in a gesture of gratitude as the rescue boat drew closer. The crew helped him aboard, offering him water, food, and the lifeline he had fought so hard to reach. His mind was in a fog, but he couldn't suppress the overwhelming sense of relief that washed over him. They took him aboard the ship and brought him below deck, where he was given medical attention. The crew was astonished by the condition in which they found him, emaciated, sunburned, and nearly delirious, but alive. Steven had made it. As the ship made its way toward the nearest port, Steven allowed himself to rest, finally able to sleep without the constant threat of the ocean's vast, indifferent expanse looming over him. He had survived against all odds, against hunger, thirst, isolation, and the relentless challenges of the sea. The ship took him to the Bahamas, where he was taken to a hospital to receive further medical care. Steven Callahan's story became legendary. His survival against the brutal forces of nature captured the world's attention and was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He had faced what seemed like insurmountable odds, yet he never gave up. He had held on to hope, fought every step of the way, and in the end had triumphed over the unforgiving sea. The lessons Steven learned on that raft would stay with him for the rest of his life. He learned not only how to survive but how to fight through adversity, how to preserve hope even when the odds seemed impossible. His story was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has an incredible capacity to endure. Steven Callahan's ordeal teaches us more than just the physical challenges of survival. It's a powerful reminder of what it takes to survive against the odds: resilience, creativity, hope, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of rescue. The ocean, with all its vastness and power, could not break Steven's will to live. In the end, it was his determination, his refusal to give up, that brought him back to safety. As we reflect on Steven's story, it's worth asking ourselves, what would we do in a similar situation? What drives us when the odds seem insurmountable? It's not just survival skills or physical strength, it's the belief that we can overcome, no matter how impossible the situation may seem. Let us know what you think. How would you have coped in Steven's place? What do you believe is the most important lesson from his journey? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and share this story to inspire others who may be facing their own struggles.